A circle in the fog. The fog had rolled in early, sliding across the mossy forest floor like a slow, deliberate breath. The sun, once golden and clear, had dulled behind layers of mist, casting the trees in a muted gray light. Branches creaked gently in the breeze, and the only sound that broke the stillness was the soft crunch of boots against damp soil. A Travelerno one would remember his name, wandered deeper into the woodlands of western Scandinavia, following an unmarked trail known only to deer and drifting wind. He was not searching for anything in particular. A quiet soul, fond of the forgotten places, he found peace in aimless wandering. But what he found that afternoon was far from ordinary. Just beyond a bramble-covered rise, half swallowed by nature's patient reclaiming hand, stood a formation of stones arranged in a perfect ring. Thick with moss and lichen, each stone rose from the earth like a silent sentinel. Some leaned slightly, tilted over centuries, yet none had fallen. The circle, almost 15 meters across, seemed untouched by time and uncannily deliberate in its design. He stood motionless, struck not by fear but a profound quietude. There was no birdsong here, no rustling squirrels or buzzing insects. Even the wind, so lively moments ago, had paused. The traveler stepped inside. The change was immediate. The air grew warmer, thicker. The smell of damp earth sharpened, and more strangely still, the sound of his own breath seemed to dull, as if the circle swallowed it whole. He stayed only a few minutes, leaving no offering, taking nothing but the image imprinted in his memory. That night he dreamed of firelight and chanting, of women weaving patterns into the soil and men drawing stars into stone. He awoke with a name on his lips, so he could not remember the next morning, but it clung to his thoughts like dew to grass. The locals knew of the circle, of course. They called it Hrafnkald's ring, though no one could agree on who Hrafnkald had been. Some said a warlord, others a priest. A few whispered that he was neither but something else entirely. The circle was not on any map, nor were its origins mentioned in the sagas, which were otherwise thorough in chronicling the deeds of kings and raiders. For centuries, it simply existed, a shape in the woods, a place where animals hesitated and compasses spun. Children dared one another to run through it on midsummer nights, and the elderly lit candles nearby for the old ones, they'd mutter, before quickly changing the subject. But in 1904, a group of amateur archaeologists from Oslo, curious about these rumors, made the trip. What they discovered didn't fit comfortably into any historical narrative. Beneath the circle, carefully buried in the soil, were remnants of bone tools, obsidian flakes not native to the region, and a series of concentric ash layer traces of fire burned in the exact center of the ring, multiple times, spaced by generations. This was not a random meeting spot, nor a pagan altar in the usual Viking sense. It was older, stranger. The lead archaeologist, Johan Ulrichsen, wrote in his private notes, never formally published, that he felt watched at all times while excavating the site. He reported that watches stopped working inside the circle. His compass needles spun without end. On the third night of camping nearby, he claimed to see a procession of pale figures moving soundlessly through the trees, each holding a stone in their arms. The next morning, he and his team packed up and left. They never returned. What they left behind, however, sparked a century-long fascination. New teams would come, dig carefully, publish cautiously. Theories bloomed like wildflowers: solar calendar, gravesite, fertility circle, astronomical calculator, a Viking version of Stonehenge. But the mystery endured. One peculiar fact caught the attention of researchers in the 1970s. The surrounding forest, despite being ancient, grew in a perfect radius around the stones, never breaching the circle's edge. Not a single tree root crossed the threshold. Trees planted inside the circle withered despite rich soil. Moss, however, thrived. Lichen patterns on the stones formed spiral shapes, no two alike, all pointing subtly inward. It was almost as if the land remembered something older than axes and ships, older even than Odin and Thor, something that had once breathed among those stones, and perhaps, in some way, still did. And so the traveler's chance encounter with Hrafnkald's ring became more than an eerie tale to share beside a fire. It became the beginning of an unraveling thread, one that, when tugged, revealed layer upon layer of secrets. Secrets buried in silence, held in place by stone and guarded by time. Whispers beneath the earth. The first real excavation began in the late spring of 1921, when a small team from the Norwegian Historical Institute, funded in part by a quiet donation from a mysterious benefactor, returned to Hrafnkald's Ring. By then, the site had gained a certain mythical status among historians and locals alike. Rumors of shifting shadows and lights with no source swirled, but the team was focused on something more grounded evidence. They began with the soil. Carefully brushing back the centuries-old leaf litter and moss, the archaeologists discovered that the ground beneath the stone circle was layered in alternating bands of blackened earth and pale sand. The pattern repeated 7 distinct bands, each separated by several inches of untouched soil. Radiocarbon testing wasn't yet available, but even by examining the texture and content of the layers, it became clear these weren't the result of a single ceremonial burn, but of several, over generations, perhaps even centuries. At the center of the circle, exactly where the ground was slightly depressed, they uncovered small clusters of charred bones, bird bones, fish bones, and in one case what appeared to be the lower jaw of a red fox. None of these were placed randomly. The bones lay in tidy formations, often surrounded by pebbles tinted with mineral stains that were not native to the area. The arrangement of one such cluster caught the attention of Solveig Erlandsen, a young field assistant with a keen eye. A ring of 12 stones encircled the fox jaw. Inside the ring, the stones bore faint indentations, almost like fingerprints pressed into wet clay, though hardened by time. She noted the symmetry, the careful spacing, the sense of intention in every placement. Solveig also noticed something else. Each night, after spending the day cataloging finds within the circle, she had trouble sleeping. She described the sensation as being whispered to just beyond hearing. Others in the team confessed similar experiences, though most dismissed it as nerves or the thrill of discovery. Still, the unease lingered. But what truly surprised the researchers was what lay beyond the immediate ring. Just outside the circle's perimeter, where the trees began again, they unearthed 2 oval-shaped depressions, shallow, coffin-sized, and lined with smooth stones. Within each, they found a skeleton. Unlike the typical Viking burial, there were no weapons, no shields, no adornments. Only the bones, curled on their sides, knees tucked up gently like sleepers. Both skeletons were female, and both remarkably well preserved for their age. The teeth were worn but intact. The bones bore no signs of trauma. In each burial, a flat stone had been placed beneath the head like a pillow, and beneath the pillow, tucked in a hollow of the stone, was a single carved bead. The beads were unlike any others catalogued in Norse sites. One was deep green, flecked with veins of pale blue. The other, an opaque red, seemed to shimmer faintly even in the shade. Both bore carving spirals, circles within circles etched so finely that they could only be seen at certain angles. The team, at a loss, recorded the graves as unusual ceremonial burials. But Solveig had her own theory, one she only recorded in the margins of her journal. These women weren't buried beside the circle, they kept watch. Later that year, the bones were transported to Oslo for further study, but the red bead was misplaced in transit. It was never found again. In 1922, a visiting Danish folklorist named Thorkild Broger proposed a strange idea after reviewing the excavation notes. He suggested that the stone circle was not merely a site of ritual, but a threshold, a carefully maintained boundary between realms, marked and watched over by chosen guardians. The presence of the women, the beads, the concentric fire layers, and the complete lack of ordinary Viking tools or markings all pointed to something more ancient than even Norse myth. He published a short paper proposing that these circles could be remnants of a Proto-Nordic spiritual practice, possibly shamanic in nature, preserved in whispers long before Odin had a name. The mainstream academic community ignored it, but the whispers continued. One oddity persisted throughout every excavation. Sound inside the circle behaved strangely. Recordings made within the perimeter always returned muffled, missing frequencies. Footsteps seemed softer. Birds avoided flying overhead. When the team tried to play music inside the ring, an old Nordic hymn recorded on wax cylinder, it skipped repeatedly at the same measure, despite functioning properly elsewhere. But perhaps the most curious discovery of all, came from an unexpected source, a mole. During the final weeks of excavation, Solveig noticed a fresh mound of soil near one of the guardian graves. Curious, she began to dig gently. Just beneath the surface, tangled in roots and loose soil, lay a smooth stone unlike the others. Perfectly round, the size of a clenched fist, and cold to the touch. When cleaned, it revealed something no one could explain, a carved spiral, similar to the beads, but inlaid with a faint metallic glint. Tests showed trace elements of a metal not found in the surrounding area, likely brought from far away, perhaps even across the sea. They called it the Heartstone. Its origin remains unknown, but every researcher who held it described the same thing, a brief sensation of stillness, like standing in a dream where time no longer moved. The dig ended quietly. The site was recovered, the forest allowed to reclaim it once more. But the records remained. The photographs, the careful notes, the impressions of something not quite Viking, not quite forgotten, just hidden, just waiting. The star map theory. Years passed before anyone returned to Hrafnkald's ring. Interest flickered and dimmed, like a candle in an abandoned hall, until the early 1960s, when a curious man named Edvin Sorensen arrived with nothing but a folding chair, a star chart, and a mind full of questions. Edvin was not an archaeologist. He wasn't even a historian. He was an amateur astronomer who had once taught mathematics at a rural schoolhouse near Bergen. He'd read about the stone circle in an obscure Norwegian journal while researching ancient calendar systems. Something about the measured placement of the stones, the symmetry, had tugged at him. And so, in the early summer of 1963, Edvin made his way into the forest with a compass, a sextant, and a notebook full of sketches. For 3 nights he camped beside the circle, waking just before dusk and charting the stars as they shifted overhead. He measured angles between stones, marked the shadows they cast under moonlight, and noted one strange alignment every year. On the summer solstice, the rising sun would slip through a gap between 2 specific stones, slightly taller and darker than the rest, sending a golden line that pierced straight through the center of the ring. It wasn't just beautiful, it was precise. Over the next year, Edvin returned several times, each visit confirming his growing suspicion the layout of Hrafnkald's ring wasn't arbitrary. It was a kind of observatory, a calendar carved in silence and stone. He began to overlay star maps from Viking-era skies over sketches of the circle. One night, staring at the northern sky, he saw it. The stones, when viewed from a specific angle just outside the circle, matched the formation of Ursa Majortha Great Bear Down to the tilt of the tail. Other stones seemed to correspond with Polaris, Vega, and Altair. Not perfectly, but enough to suggest a pattern. Enough to make one wonder. Edvin shared his findings in a small conference in Stavanger. His theory, though met with polite nods, was largely dismissed. The prevailing thought was that the Vikings, while seafaring geniuses, didn't build stone monuments for star mapping. But Edvin persisted. He pointed to burial mounds aligned with solstices, to rune stones that spoke of the fire in the sky, and to oral traditions that hinted at the bear that never sleeps. He called his theory the Night Compass, a poetic name for a practical tool. Later that year, he returned to the circle with a friend who worked in radio frequencies. Together, they set up a crude antenna just outside the ring to test for magnetic anomalies. What they found was unexpected. Inside the circle, signal strength dropped sharply, not due to interference, but to absence, as if something ancient and quiet absorbed the signal like a sponge. More intriguing still, when they played a tone at 432, the so-called natural resonance used in some early religious music, the sound faded almost entirely when it entered the circle. It didn't echo, it didn't distort, it just stopped. Edvin was convinced. The circle had been built not only to chart the sky, but to mimic it, to serve as a reflection of the heavens, locked into the land. The positioning of the stones hinted at seasonal gatherings, perhaps solstice ceremonies or stargazing rites. He imagined hooded figures standing silently as the stars turned above, following celestial rhythms most had long forgotten. It wasn't religion, he thought. It was reverence, a way of remaining in sync with something far older than any god. He also noted a curious quirk. Several of the stones bore what looked like shallow grooves, not decorative but worn, like fingers had traced them repeatedly over years. Some aligned with the rising of Sirius. Others pointed low to the horizon, toward where the Pleiades might shimmer on a cold October night. Was this how the builders marked time? Not in calendars or runes, but in positions and shadows? There was one particularly strange incident during Edvin's fifth visit. One cold, clear night in late autumn, he reported waking abruptly to find the air unnaturally still. He stepped into the circle and noticed a beam of moonlight shining perfectly down the Centera fluke of timing and season. But what unsettled him was the smell. Not smoke, not moss, but something sharp and metallic, like iron in water. It faded as quickly as it came. After that night, he never returned. He continued writing, however. In a short monograph privately published in 1965, he described Hrafnkald's ring as a forgotten lens for reading the sky, built by hands who feared being forgotten. He speculated that the builders weren't Vikings in the traditional sense, but an older, more isolated people who had watched the stars not for navigation, but for meaning. He died quietly in 1973. His papers were boxed up by his niece and forgotten in an attic for decades. When finally rediscovered in the early 2000s, they added yet another layer to the circle's growing mystery. Today, a small plaque near the edge of the forest bears his name, though few who pass it understand the depth of his obsession. But every now and then, when the sky is clear and the wind is low, someone might stand within the circle and look up, tracing with their eyes the invisible lines once drawn by stars and stone. And for a moment, it almost makes sense. The forest clan of Vestlandet. Long before maps charted every inlet and trail, before kings claimed crowns and sagas etched their way into memory, there were people who lived in the folds of the land quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely beyond the reach of history. In the deep woods of Vestlandet, between the fingers of narrow fjords and thick pine, these people thrived. They were not Vikings in the sense most imagine. They did not sail longships or raid monasteries. Instead, they watched, they listened, and they built in stone. Local folklore, stitched together from centuries of whispers and winter stories, calls them the Skogfolk, the forest people. Sometimes praised, sometimes feared, they were said to live in scattered communities, rarely more than a few families, tucked into hillside clearings where the sun barely touched the moss. No records name them directly. No church scrolls document their conversion or rebellion. Yet their presence lingers in the patterns of abandoned terraces, in worn footpaths no wider than a deer trail, and most curiously, in the design of the old stone circles. Elderly villagers from isolated hamlets tell tales passed down from grandmothers and great-grandmothers. Stories of women who brewed strange teas from fungi and fern, of children who learned to mimic bird calls before speech, of quiet men who disappeared into the forest for weeks and returned with antlers bound to their backs. Most of these stories sound like bedtime fables, but one detail appears again and again, no matter the teller they gathered at the stones. The Skogfolk, it was said, came together only under moonlight. The rings were not meeting places for feasts or speeches, they were sacred and dangerous. Entry was permitted only on certain nights. The wrong step, the wrong time, and you risked vanishing, swallowed by the breath beneath the stone. As poetic as it sounds, a handful of early records suggest these beliefs were taken seriously. A monk writing in 1153 noted that his missionary trip to the western forests was met not with violence, but with averted eyes and warnings of the stone sleepers. In 1982, a forest surveyor named Marta Lindqvist stumbled across what she believed to be an ancient camp not far from Hrafnkald's ring. She found fire pits carefully lined with quartz pebbles, strange bone carvings resembling wolves and owls, and a cluster of flat-topped stones forming a half-circle. The stones bore shallow indentations, seating perhaps, or altars. Among the debris was a stone tool shaped like a crescent moon. Its surface was polished smooth from long use, though it showed no practical function. Marta's discovery spurred renewed curiosity. Over the next few years, discreet digs revealed that the forests around the stone circle were not as untouched as previously thought. Beneath centuries of leaf fall, they found post holes, worn hearths, and traces of woven flooring, likely from temporary huts or tents. These structures bore none of the grand craftsmanship of Viking longhouses. They were functional, minimalist, meant to disappear when abandoned. But more interesting still were the artifacts. Dozens of small clay discs were uncovered, each no larger than a child's palm, painted with spirals and what looked like eyes. Some had been broken deliberately. Others were charred around the edges. A few were pierced as if worn or hung. They were unlike any known Viking religious object, lacking both Norse and Christian symbolism. Instead, they seemed personal, protective, perhaps talismans or tokens for passage. One disc, found buried beneath a tree root just outside the circle, bore an image that disturbed more than one researcher. It depicted a line of human figures walking into a large oval, surrounded by flames or rays. Inside, their shapes changed, elongated, merged, distorted. Though crude, the impression was unmistakable, a transformation. This led to the emergence of a new theory among fringe historians. What if the Forest clan weren't simply isolated villagers? What if they represented a surviving fragment of a pre-Viking spiritual tradition, older than Thor, older than Odin, and perhaps even older than agriculture itself? In this version of the past, the forest dwellers weren't barbarians or outcasts. They were caretakers, keepers of a sacred practice long dismissed by the expanding Norse world. The stone circles weren't just ceremonial, they were thresholds, places where reality thinned, where memory could be shaped. Supporting this theory was another odd discovery: sound patterns. When modern sound technicians tested the resonance inside the ring again, they found that rhythmic drumming at certain frequencies created standing waves within the circle, a soft thrum that could be felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. These waves coincided with measurements taken at other megalithic sites across Europe, from Callanish in Scotland to the Carnac stones in France. Were the Skogfolk part of a wider pan-European ritual culture? One that used resonance, repetition, and symbolic geometry to alter perception? None could say for sure. But an old woman in the nearby village of Eidfjord recalled a phrase her grandmother used whenever she passed the tree line at dusk. "Don't speak where stone remembers." Today, only fragments of the Forest clan's legacy remain. A chipped tool here, a faded design there. But in the silence of the circle, when the moon rises just right, some say the moss shifts as if underfoot, that if you stand very still you can hear something breathing, not behind you, not beside you, below. The Druidic influence debate. In the winter of 1994, a soft-spoken Irish historian named Alistair Keneally arrived quietly in Bergen, carrying a weathered leather satchel full of scrolls, photographs, and a single annotated map of Western Norway. He wasn't the first scholar to visit Norway seeking a forgotten connection, but he was one of the few who did so not in search of conquest or migration, but of memory. Alistair had spent decades studying the spiritual practices of the ancient Celts, particularly the Druids, the priestly class said to bridge the natural and divine worlds. Though records of their rites were nearly obliterated by time and empire, enough fragments remained in the soil and in story to suggest that their influence stretched far beyond the misty hills of Ireland and Wales. Some believed they traveled not just as emissaries or traders, but as keepers of sacred knowledge. Keneally's theory was simple and daring: that during the first centuries before and after the Common Era, as pressure from Roman expansion mounted, small groups of Druidic practitioners left the British Isles, carrying their rituals with them. Some went south, others vanished into the Alps, but a few, he believed, traveled north, across the sea, into the cold, quiet forests of Scandinavia, where they found others who honored stone and silence the way they did. When he first read about Hrafnkald's ring and the strange findings at its core fire layers, stone talismans, the absence of Viking weaponry, it stirred something in him. The details echoed what he'd studied in pre-Roman sites scattered across Brittany and northern Spain: circular formations, spiraled carvings, unusual burial placements. The first time he stood within the circle, snow still clinging to the roots of the trees, he whispered the old Irish word for sanctuary Ionad. And though he had come alone, he felt acknowledged, not welcomed, not warned, simply observed. Keneally's theory hinged on a specific detail: the spiral motif. Found across Celtic sites from Newgrange to Brodgar, spirals had always represented the turning of time, the passage between life and death, and the idea that existence did not end, but curved. At Hrafnkald's ring, spirals appeared again and again on beads, on moss-coated stones, in faint grooves beneath the earth. They were not decorative. They were directional, symbolic, intentional. Critics of his theory were swift and loud. The idea of cross-cultural contact that far north during that era was viewed as speculative at best. There were no confirmed records of Druids in Norway, no written accounts tying Celtic mystics to Viking homelands. And yet, there were clues. One such clue came from a peculiar burial site on the western edge of Ireland. Near the village of Ballyvaughan, an ancient cairn had been excavated in 1988. Among the grave goods was a stone disc bearing an uncanny resemblance to one unearthed at Hrafnkald's ring, same size, same spiral pattern, even the same mineral composition, despite their separation by sea and centuries. Keneally naturally was captivated. He spent months comparing ceremonial structures across regions. He noted that both Druidic and early Scandinavian sites often favored liminal places, shorelines, forest edges, high hills, places neither fully one thing nor another, transitional zones, doorways between the seen and unseen. He also noted that in both traditions, trees held deep meaning. The Celtic reverence for oak and ash mirrored Scandinavian associations with Yggdrasil, the world tree. In both, certain groves were considered sacred. Both used circles not as enclosures, but as portals. His most controversial claim was that Hrafnkald's ring was not simply inspired by Druidic ideas, but may have been built with Druidic hands, perhaps generations before the Vikings even arrived. He speculated that the forest clan of Vestlandet could have been descendants of this cultural blending, part Norse, part Celt, with beliefs shaped by silence and time. To support this, he referenced a 10th century Irish poem that described a ring of stones where the stars do weep and roots drink dreams through frost and sleep. Long dismissed as metaphor, Keneally believed it referred to a real place, perhaps even this place. He also pointed to linguistic traces. In an old local dialect spoken in the fjord valleys, the word drifa, meaning drift or snowfall, was used to describe moments of sudden silence, especially in forests. A similar word in Old Irish, drui, referred to magic or sorcery roots that may not be coincidental. But perhaps the most peculiar link came from a child. During a local folklore festival in 1995, a young boy from Eidfjord recited a rhyme his grandmother had taught him. It spoke of a circle in the woods where the leaf whisperers hum to the rocks, and where no blade shall bite, nor voice echo. The phrasing, though charming, bore striking similarity to passages from medieval Celtic texts describing Druidic sanctuaries, particularly the taboo against steel within sacred groves, and the belief that certain chants could never be spoken aloud. The rhyme, the stones, the silence, it was all part of a pattern. Keneally published his findings in a modest, self-funded book titled The Lost Grove Tracing Druidic Memory in the North. Though largely ignored by mainstream academia, it gained a quiet following. Scholars, poets, and spiritual seekers began visiting the circle in winter, laying pine needles at its edge, walking its perimeter without stepping inside. Whether Druids truly crossed the sea or not, the idea took root in the minds of those who came after. A story of shared memory, of sacred stone carried by frostbitten hands, whispered through fir and flame. And on rare nights when the wind shifts and the snow falls sideways through the trees, visitors to Hrafnkald's ring have reported hearing something faint, not voices exactly, but a kind of low rhythmic humming, like the echo of a name forgotten but not lost. Sound that never echoes. It was in the early 2000s that a quiet revolution in how we study ancient sites began, not through shovels or parchment, but through sound. A team of acoustic archaeologists, led by Dr. Linnea Dahl, turned their attention to Hrafnkald's ring with a single question. What does the stone remember? Not through sight or soil, but through resonance. The idea had gained traction across Europe. At sites like Newgrange in Ireland and the Hypogeum in Malta, researchers had discovered that certain frequencies of sound produced unusual effects, lingering echoes, vibrating walls, even changes in how people felt when exposed to specific tones. These weren't just ruins. They were instruments. Hrafnkald's ring, however, posed a different mystery. From the very first test, Dr. Dahl noticed something unusual. She and her team set up speakers at 4 points within the circle, and broadcast a series of tones at precise frequencies 432 Hz, 528 Hz, and a deeper 110 Hz, all used in various ancient traditions. The expectation was that the sound would either echo faintly off the stones or disperse across the clearing. Instead, the sound seemed to vanish. Not muffle, not distort. Vanish. They tested it again and again. Within the circle, the tones lost intensity far more rapidly than expected. There was no echo, no reflection. It was as if the sound waves passed through the air and dropped into the earth. Outside the circle, the sound behaved normally. Inside, it fell flat. They tried clapping. No bounce. Even footsteps sounded duller, like walking on a heavy carpet in a library. It wasn't just their instruments. Several members of the team independently noted that their own voices felt strangely muted within the ring as though they were speaking into heavy snow. One technician described the experience as talking to yourself underwater. Fascinated, they brought in geologists and soil experts, hoping to find a physical cause. But the stones were ordinary glacial granite. The soil was dense but unremarkable. No magnetic fields, no underground caverns. Nothing in the physical sense should have caused that much sound absorption. Still, the silence persisted. Intrigued by the mystery, Dr. Dahl began to look for patterns. She studied the arrangement of the stones more closely and discovered that they formed acoustic dead zone small spots where sound interference naturally canceled itself out. These weren't random. The stones had been placed with intention, tuned like a harp of stillness. Even stranger, the largest stone in the circle, commonly called the listener by locals, was found to slightly vibrate when certain tones were played outside the circle, especially when directed at it from the southeast. Not enough to see with the eye, but enough to register on sensitive equipment. This led to a remarkable theory that the ring was designed not to create sound, but to erase it. A sacred silence chamber, a place where rituals could be conducted beyond the reach of the ordinary world. A space where voices could not escape, where what was spoken stayed within. One of the field researchers, a soft-spoken linguist named Eric Thune, recalled sitting quietly in the center of the circle for nearly an hour. No tools, no tests, just silence. He said it was the first time in years he'd truly heard nothing. Not birds, not wind, not even his own breath. It was a silence so complete that it pressed on the chest. He later wrote in his notes, "It's like the circle is listening, but refuses to speak back." That phrase stuck. Over the following months, the team experimented with human voice frequencies, chants, and spoken word. One assistant tried reading from an old Norse poem, Voluspa, just outside the ring, then again inside. The recording from outside was crisp, the tone rich. Inside? It came back faint, distant, hollow as though the voice had aged hundreds of years between breath and echo. Then came the final test stone that Dr. Dahl had delayed, uncertain of its implications. They played a recording of a human heartbeat. The sound, amplified and rhythmic, pulsed steadily through the clearing. Outside the circle, it echoed gently like a drum in the mist. But inside the circle, the heartbeat flattened, becoming soft, erratic, even halting in some instances until it almost stopped. Not in the audio file, but in perception. It felt wrong, disjointed. After that test, 2 members of the team chose not to return. But for Dr. Dahl, the experience confirmed her theory the circle was not a space of performance but withdrawal. It wasn't designed to amplify human ritual, but to contain it, protect it, perhaps even shield it from time, from sound, from memory. She titled her final paper, "The Architecture of Silence, an acoustic study of Hrafnkald's ring." In it, she proposed that ancient builders understood resonance and silence not scientifically, but intuitively, and that this circle might have served as a place where thoughts were given to stone whispered into the earth with the certainty they would not escape. Today, researchers and curious travelers alike still step into the circle and pause, not because of fear, but because of the absence, the strange quiet, the knowledge that here in this ring of moss and stone, even the wind holds its breath. And in that pause, in that stillness, one might wonder not what the circle was built for, but who it was built to contain. The bone in the foundation. The restoration began quietly in the autumn of 2009, under gray skies and low cloud cover. A conservation team tasked not with excavation, but with gentle preservation was sent to Hrafnkald's ring after concerns arose that heavy rains and root overgrowth were threatening the stability of some of the stones. The project was meant to be brief, non-invasive, a careful propping up of history, but what they found buried beneath the central stone was anything but ordinary. The central stone was one of the shorter pillars, less imposing than the others, but unmistakably significant. It sat directly at the heart of the circle, where the ground had long been depressed, almost like a navel in the forest floor. The moss around it was especially thick, and for years no one had dared to shift it, fearing disturbance of the circle's unique acoustics. But erosion had begun to tilt the stone ever so slightly, and so the team decided to carefully lift and stabilize its base. That was when the trowel struck something hard. Not stone, not root, but bone. At first they assumed it was an animal, perhaps a fox or badger, but brushing back the damp soil revealed something far more human. A single femur, perfectly clean, slightly discolored by the soil but otherwise intact, positioned not haphazardly but deliberately angled at 45 degrees, with the rounded head pointing west and the shaft running beneath the exact center of the stone. There was no coffin, no other bones nearby, no grave goods. Just this one long bone, nestled in a bed of tightly packed river pebbles, as if it had been placed, not buried. The discovery halted work immediately. The local authorities were notified. Forensic anthropologists arrived days later, and their findings only deepened the mystery. The bone belonged to an adult human, likely female, aged somewhere between 35 and 50. The surface of the femur bore no marks of trauma, no signs of cutting or binding. But the compactness of the bone, its mineral density, suggested the individual had walked often, possibly across uneven terrain, for much of her life. Carbon dating, once conducted, placed the bone around 240 to nearly 600 years before the Viking Age. It predated the Norse myths. It predated the sagas. It even predated the widely accepted construction period of Hrafnkald's ring. The implications were dizzying. Had the stone circle been built on top of this offering? Was the ring a later addition, layered over an older sacred site? Or had the builders deliberately integrated the bone into the foundation, merging memory with architecture? Some proposed that the bone was symbolic, a totem of sorts, meant to root the space in ancestral energy. Others suggested it might have been part of a foundational sacrifice, a practice not unknown in early Northern Europe. There were stories, half remembered, half dismissed, of ancient builders placing bones, or even whole bodies, beneath bridges, gates, and thresholds to bind the structure with spirit. But there was another theory, a quieter one, that the bone belonged to the first Dream Era figure mentioned only once in local folklore, an unnamed woman who, according to the tale, was the first to hear the stones speak, who sat upon the moss and fell into sleep so deep it touched the roots. Her dreams, the story claimed, curved the shadows and curled the paths of light. The Forest clan in this version did not build the circle for her, they built it around her. No inscription was found, no rune, no name, just the bone sleeping in the soil. Out of respect, and perhaps uncertainty, the team chose to leave it undisturbed. After documenting its position and condition, they carefully repacked the earth and lowered the central stone back into place. No plaque marks the site. No photo of the bone was released to the public. Only a notation in the team's internal logbook remains, filed under a simple title, Foundation Element Anomaly 1. Since that discovery, a subtle shift has taken place in how people approach the circle. Visitors speak more softly. Some leave tokens at the base of the central stone, a feather, a pine cone, a folded note. Many don't know why they do it. It just feels appropriate. One schoolteacher who visited with her class described the experience this way. The children were laughing and running until they stepped into the circle. Then, they just stopped. No one told them to. They just stood there, looking at the ground like something ancient was watching. And perhaps it was, because something happens when one kneels beside that central stone. The sound fades, the air thickens, the light seems to pause in its fall. And if you sit still long enough, you might feel something beneath you, not a breeze or a tremor, but a quiet pull, a sense of gravity not from the sky above, but from the stories resting far below. And in that moment, you begin to understand this was never just architecture, never just ritual. It was memory, compressed into stone, anchored by bone, a whisper from the earth itself. The Woman in the Blue Veil. In the spring of 1919, long before the first official excavation at Hrafnkald's Ring, a traveling artist named Annelies Sjögren wandered into the Vestlandet woods in search of solitude. She had come from Stockholm by train, carrying only a canvas roll and a diary. Grief clung to her like fog. She had lost her sister that winter to influenza, and no studio nor city corner could hold her sorrow. She needed quiet, she wrote, a place where the world has forgotten itself. Annelie rented a cabin near Eidfjord and spent her days walking, sketching moss-covered roots and the sloping light of northern trees. But one evening, just before dusk, she strayed from her usual path. A crow had taken off suddenly, circling overhead before diving eastward. Curious, she followed. She later described it as if the forest pulled back for her branches parting, light shifting, until she stepped into a wide clearing she had never seen before. There, in the fading gold of day, stood the circle. She didn't know what it was, not then. She only wrote this: I found something that does not want to be found. And yet, it let me in. That night, she returned to the cabin and began to paint, feverishly. 4 canvases over 4 days, all in blues and grays, all circular. At the center of each was a figure cloaked, feminine, always veiled. The face was never shown. Around her swirled shapestrees melting into stone, hands reaching skyward, eyes embedded in bark. When asked by her host about the woman in the painting, Annelies simply said she was waiting. Years later, those paintings would come to be known as the Veil series. Today, they hang in a quiet gallery in Oslo. But the final piece in the set, the one she never exhibited, is different. Hidden in a private collection, this last painting shows the woman at the center of the stone circle, arms raised, veil floating like smoke. Around her, the stones are glowing, and above her, where the sky should be, is a spiral. When the canvas was examined under infrared in 1997, curators discovered something strange. Beneath the spiral, beneath layers of pigment, lay a set of numbers 240, 13. The significance wasn't understood until decades later when the femur beneath the central stone was carbon dated to the early 3rd century, 240 CE. The match was impossible. Annelie had died in 1923. More curious still was her diary. In the weeks following her discovery of the circle, her entries changed. At first they were poetic fragments of emotion and landscape, but then came detail, geometry, measurement. She began to describe dreams in which she stood among tall stones, surrounded by whispering voices. In one entry she wrote, "She tells me how they danced, not for gods, but for balance, to remind the world not to forget the silence." She started wearing blue veils herself. A neighbor claimed to have seen her sitting perfectly still at the forest edge for hours, lips moving, eyes open but unfocused. When asked what she was doing, Annelies said, "Listening. She's not finished speaking." Then one day, she vanished. Her cabin was left unlocked, her canvases untouched. The locals searched the woods for days but found no trace, no footprints, no belongings, only a small bundle of blue fabric caught on a low-hanging branch, halfway between the village and the ring. Her disappearance was written off as a case of heartbreak or madness, but her name remained in local memory, passed down quietly, respectfully, the lady who followed the stones. It wasn't until 2003 that a group of hikers, guided by a forest map from the Conservation Office, stumbled across something strange just north of the circle, a shallow depression in the earth, lined with stones. Not quite a grave, not quite a shelter. At the center was a flat rock, stained blue on one side, as if fabric had rested there for a very long time. Tests on the soil revealed traces of a rare lycanone used historically in the making of deep blue dye. Was it hers? Was it ever hers to begin with? The Veil series began attracting more attention in the years that followed. Spiritual communities, artists, and dream researchers grew fascinated by the images. Theories abounded that Annelie had been chosen, that she had remembered something through her grief, that the forest had opened to her because she was already slipping between worlds. But those who visit the ring now sometimes bring with them a strip of blue fabric. They tie it to a branch, or lay it softly on a stone, and sit in silence. And sometimes, only sometimes, those who sit long enough breathe slow enough, claim to feel it too. A presence. Not frightening, not kind, just watching. And if they close their eyes, they sometimes dream of a woman in blue, walking the circle in slow, deliberate steps, veil brushing the moss as if to remind the stone you are not forgotten. I am still here. The Forgotten Rune Master. In the shifting tides of history, some voices roar loudly, recorded in sagas and etched into stone. Others whisper softly, their stories nearly swallowed by time. One such whisper belongs to a figure known only by the faintest trace, the Forgotten Rune Master of Hrafnkald's Ring. Unlike the renowned rune masters whose names survived through carved monuments, this artisan left no signature. Instead, his or possibly her work lies hidden in plain sight, subtle marks on several of the ring stones, so delicate they are nearly invisible to the untrained eye. The discovery came in 1978, during a detailed photographic survey led by linguist Ingrid Halvorsen. Using oblique sunlight and high-contrast film, Ingrid aimed to capture every scratch and weathered groove on the stones. One evening, as the sun sank low, she noticed a series of faint linear incisions on the underside of a smaller standing stone, oriented away from the circle's center. At first glance, they seemed random scratches made by centuries of frost and root growth. But Ingrid had studied runic inscriptions for years, and something about their rhythm caught her attention. She began documenting similar marks on 3 other stones scattered irregularly around the circle's perimeter. Months of analysis followed. The lines didn't form standard runes, no Norse alphabet, no familiar symbols, but rather a unique cipher, a combination of diagonal cuts, dots, and short curves that resembled a code. This cryptic system didn't match any known runic alphabet. Instead, it appeared to be a personal cipher, possibly created to encode specific knowledge accessible only to initiates. Ingrid hypothesized that this rune master was not merely a carver of messages, but a keeper of secrets, someone who sought to hide meaning beneath the surface of the stones, just as the builders had hidden bone beneath the earth. Adding weight to her theory was a curious linguistic oddity. In a rarely used Old Norse word, Hrafnkaldur, the circle's namesake, means cold raven. Ravens were sacred in Norse mythology, linked to Odin, but the word also carried a coded meaning among rune practitioners, the watcher who speaks in silence. Was the rune master that watcher? One especially intriguing mark appeared to resemble a bird in flight, its wings outstretched. Paired with a series of dots in a triangular formation, Ingrid speculated that this could represent a celestial map, perhaps the flight path of a star or constellation used for navigation or ritual. Scholars debated fiercely. Some dismissed the cipher as natural erosion. Others proposed it was an ancient form of proto-writing, a communication method between secret groups. No definitive translation emerged, but a small community of enthusiasts attempted to decipher the marks, suggesting meanings related to protection, threshold, and dream. Interestingly, folklore from nearby regions referenced a mysterious figure, the silent scribe who taught the forest clan how to carve messages only visible in certain light or seasons. Children told tales of runes that vanished when spoken aloud and reappeared only under the cold moonlight. Ingrid herself became somewhat obsessed, spending long nights at the circle, shining torches and tracing the incisions, trying to coax the stones into revealing their message. She reported feelings of unease, as if being watched by unseen eyes. Though her work remains unpublished, her notebooks were posthumously donated to a Norwegian museum and remain a subject of quiet fascination. The rune master's identity is lost to time, but through these silent marks, a faint voice persists, telling of a guardian who chose stone over speech, mystery over fame, weaving stories in shadow that may yet guide those willing to listen. And so, the stones keep their secrets, waiting patiently for another whisper. The circle's seasonal secrets. When the seasons shift in the north, the light changes in ways both subtle and profound. For the builders of Hrafnkald's Ring, these shifts were more than mere background. They were woven into the very fabric of the circle's design, a living calendar etched in stone. In 2015, an interdisciplinary team of archaeologists, astronomers, and environmental scientists collaborated on a year-long study of the ring's relationship with the changing sun and moon. Their goal to understand if and how the stones marked the passage of time beyond simple alignment with solstices. What they discovered was an intricate system of seasonal marker stones, positioned to cast shadows or reveal sunlight patterns only on specific days throughout the year. One slender pillar, nicknamed the Watcher, projected a long shadow that reached the ring's center precisely on the first day of autumn. Another stone caught the moon's glow in a way that created a glowing path only during the midwinter full moon. But what set this site apart was a rarely noticed feature, a small, low stone embedded just outside the eastern edge of the circle. It was weathered almost flat, and from the center of the ring it was invisible to the naked eye. Yet, on the spring equinox, the rising sun cast a perfect shaft of light that struck this stone, illuminating a tiny carved spiral barely a few centimeters across. This tiny spiral matched those found on the clay discs discovered years earlier, those tokens of the mysterious forest clan. It seemed to be a reset button for the cycle, a visual cue marking the renewal of the year. The team recorded these events meticulously, using time-lapse cameras and laser measurement tools. They observed that the builders had accounted for the moon's irregular cycle, not just the sun's steady path. Some stones aligned to rare lunar standstills occurring every 6 years, events still tracked by modern astronomers. This revealed a sophistication that baffled many, especially considering the absence of written records describing such complex astronomical knowledge in early Scandinavia. One evening, as twilight settled and the sun dipped behind the western hills, the team gathered silently within the circle. They watched as the final rays slipped through a narrow gap between two tall stones, casting a golden beam across the mossy floor. The beam struck the exact center, illuminating the low eastern stone. A soft murmur broke the quiet. An older member of the team, a folklorist named Jens, whispered, "This is not just a calendar. It's a story, told in light and shadow. A reminder that time is not only measured, but felt." The team also noticed a quirky detail at exactly midnight during the summer solstice. The temperature inside the circle was consistently cooler by almost a degree Celsius compared to the surrounding forest. It was a small effect, but persistent, suggesting the stones affected airflow and heat retention. For the ancient builders, these subtle shifts may have been significant signs from nature confirming the circle's role as a sacred temple of time. The seasonal cycles marked by the stones weren't just practical tools for farming or hunting. They were woven into the rhythm of ritual, community, and memory. Each year, as the sun and moon traced their ancient paths, the circle came alive with silent reminders of life's endless turning. And for those who watch, the stones whisper that time itself is a circle never-ending, always returning. The mysterious moss markings. Moss is usually just something soft and green, growing quietly on stone and soil. But at Hrafnkald's ring, moss holds secrets older than anyone imagined. In 2018, a biologist named Kari Nilsson joined the ongoing research to study the types of moss growing on and around the stones. She expected common varieties species typical to northern forests, but what she found was unusual: several patches of moss with unique growth patterns and colors, clustered only on certain stones and in specific spots. These mosses weren't random. They formed shapes and symbols, spirals, dots, and lines that resembled the ancient carvings found on the clay discs and hidden runic marks. What was more surprising was that these moss patterns seemed to change with the seasons. During spring and autumn, the moss grew more vibrantly, revealing clearer shapes. In winter, the patterns faded, only to reappear as the sun returned. Kari took samples for genetic analysis. The moss contained a rare species of lichen that glowed faintly under ultraviolet light, a bioluminescence that was rarely seen in Scandinavian mosses. The glow was subtle but consistent, enough that in complete darkness the stones appeared to shimmer softly. Folklore in the region spoke of the stone's breath, an ancient term locals used to describe how the circle seemed to breathe with the forest. Kari's discovery provided a possible explanation: the moss and lichen acted as a living, breathing part of the circle, responding to environmental rhythms and perhaps even signaling certain times or events. One particularly quirky finding was how small animals like forest mice and birds interacted with the moss. Some birds were observed using the moss to line their nests, possibly attracted by its bioluminescent quality. Meanwhile, mossy patches seemed to repel certain insects, creating tiny safe zones on the stones. The moss was more than decoration. It was an active, living participant in the circle's mysterious ecosystem. Carrie wondered if the ancient builders had deliberately chosen stones and locations to encourage the growth of these special mosses. Perhaps they understood the moss as a natural signal, a way to connect stone, forest, and sky in a subtle dance of light and life. Local legend tells of times when the stones would glow softly on moonless nights, guiding lost travelers home. Carris research suggests that this could have been real nature's own lantern, powered by the quiet glow of moss and lichen, growing patiently through centuries. And so, the circle is not just stone and bone and shadow, it is alive, breathing quietly beneath the canopy, holding stories in every glowing patch, waiting for the next listener to notice the gentle light. The ritual of the whispering stones. Among the many theories about Hrafnkald's ring, one of the most enchanting is the idea that it served as a space for a ritual known as the Whispering Stones. This ceremony, mentioned only briefly in obscure medieval Icelandic manuscripts, involved participants speaking secrets into the stones to be carried away by the wind and absorbed by the earth. In 1927, a folklorist named Sigurd Einarsson collected fragments of oral tradition from elderly villagers near the ring. They recalled stories of silent talk, where individuals would visit the stones to whisper their worries, hopes, and regrets, believing the circle could carry away their burdens. The ritual was said to occur only during the darkest nights of winter, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Participants approached the circle alone, spoke softly to a chosen stone, and left without looking back. The whispered words would be lost to all but the stones themselves. During excavation in 1985, archaeologists found clusters of small, flat stones arranged near the ring's edge. Some bore faint scratches resembling ancient runes, but others were smooth, worn by handling. These whisper stones may have been tokens or vessels for the ritual. Curiously, during experimental reenactments by researchers in the early 2000s, participants reported feeling a gentle, almost imperceptible vibration in the stones immediately after speaking. Some even claimed a faint, distant echo not of their words, but of unspoken sounds, like the rustling of leaves or a soft sigh. This phenomenon puzzled scientists. It seemed the stones were responding, not with sound, but with sensation, a tactile memory of voices long gone. One participant, a linguist named Helga, noted that the sensation was stronger when she spoke in Old Norse, suggesting a connection between language and the stone's sensitivity. The ritual also involved a curious practice, the placement of tiny bundles of herbs and flowers at the base of the stones after whispering. These offerings, often lavender, thyme, and juniper, were thought to protect the whispered secrets, masking them from harmful spirits and ensuring their safe passage to the earth. The circle's unique acoustic properties likely enhanced the ritual's effect. As the stones absorbed sound, the participant's voice seemed to vanish into silence, making the experience deeply personal and meditative. Though the ritual itself faded from memory centuries ago, its echoes remain in the stones and the forest air. Visitors today sometimes sit silently within the circle, imagining their own whispered hopes carried away by the stone's embrace. And perhaps, in the quiet dark, the stones still listen. The unexpected visitor. It was a chilly autumn evening in 2012 when a curious event occurred that would become one of the more unusual tales associated with Hrafnkald's ring. A local shepherd, Jens Olav, was returning home after tending his sheep near the forest's edge. As twilight settled, Jens noticed a small, dark shape moving swiftly among the trees, seemingly watching him. At first, he thought it was a fox or a lynx common in the area, but as he drew closer to the circle, the shape moved into the clearing and stood upright, its form illuminated by the faint moonlight. It was a large raven, but unlike any raven Jens had ever seen. This bird's feathers shimmered with an iridescent blue and green glow, almost metallic, unlike the usual matte black of its kind. It let out a series of low, rhythmic croaks that seemed almost deliberate, as if calling a name lost to time. Jens, entranced and unafraid, followed the raven as it circled the stone ring. The bird hopped onto the listener stone at the circle's center and sat perfectly still, watching the forest beyond. After a few minutes, the raven took flight, disappearing silently into the night. Word spread quickly, and soon, Others reported seeing the same glowing raven near the circle during key seasonal moments, solstices and equinoxes. Local elders began to whisper that the bird was a spirit guardian, perhaps connected to Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, symbols of thought and memory. Some believed the raven was a messenger between the living and the spirits of the rings builders. What made the sightings even stranger was a nearby ancient rune stone discovered in 2010, bearing a rarely seen symbol of a bird with outstretched wings, etched alongside an enigmatic spiral. Though no scientific explanation could account for the raven's unusual coloring, biologists speculated it might be a rare mutation or a bird covered in iridescent minerals or lichen. But no conclusive evidence was found. The raven became a symbol of the circle's enduring mystery, the bridge between the physical and the spiritual, the ancient and the present. For those who visit Hrafnkald's ring today, the story of the glowing raven serves as a reminder that some secrets are meant to be watched, not solved. And sometimes, when the wind carries a soft croak through the trees, it feels as if the circle itself is calling out. The secret of the twilight fires. Long ago, before electricity and modern warmth, fire was more than survival, it was sacred. At Hrafnkald's ring, remnants of ancient hearths suggest the builders understood this deeply. In 2007, during a careful survey of the forest floor around the circle, archaeologists discovered patches of charcoal and ash hidden beneath layers of moss and soil. These remnants weren't from casual campfires, they were carefully arranged in small, shallow pits positioned near specific stones. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of unusual plant resins and herbs, including juniper and heather, burned alongside wood. These plants release fragrant smoke, often associated with purification and protection in early Scandinavian rituals. The fires were not continuous but seasonal, lit during twilight hours on key date solstices and lunar cycles matching the circle's complex alignment with celestial events. The locals told stories of twilight fires, small flames lit quietly at dusk, not for warmth or light, but as signals to the spirits. They were said to guide ancestral souls or to mark moments when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Interestingly, the fire pits were always located just outside the circle's boundary. This separation seemed deliberate, possibly designed to protect the sanctity of the silent ring, allowing smoke to rise without disturbing the quiet heart of the circle. One quirky detail from the charcoal analysis was the presence of rare pine needles burned in the fires, which produce a crackling, almost musical sound when ignited. It's believed this subtle noise complemented the silent atmosphere of the circle, creating a gentle contrast between sound and silence. Though no written records describe the twilight fires, the archaeological evidence paints a picture of a ritual deeply tied to nature's cycles, fire as messenger, smoke as language. For those who now walk the ring at dusk, the memory of these fires lingers faintly in the air, carried by the scent of pine and earth. A gentle reminder of ancient flames that once danced softly on the edge of silence. The final echoes of the builders. The centuries have softened Hrafnkald's ring, moss and lichen cloaking its stones like a gentle blanket. Yet, beneath that serene exterior lies the heartbeat of those who built it, their stories etched in stone, silence, and earth. As the last phase of research concluded in 2020, scientists and historians gathered one final time in the clearing. They shared their findings: bones embedded in soil, runes hidden in shadows, moss that glows, and sounds that vanish. Each piece a thread woven into a tapestry of mystery, but also of human connection. It became clear the circle was not merely a monument, but a living space, a place where time, nature, and memory intertwined. The builders were more than masons, they were dreamers, keepers of secrets whispered through stone and silence. They knew the power of presence and absence, crafting a sanctuary where voices faded but stories endured. The ring's architecture, its strange acoustic silence, and the delicate balance with seasonal light and moss suggest a culture deeply attuned to the rhythms of earth and sky. But what truly lingers is the human touch, the lone bone beneath the stone, the whispered prayers carried by wind, the blue-veiled artist who vanished into legend, and the raven that still watches from the trees. These echoes remind us that history is alive, held not just in texts or artifacts, but in the spaces between the silences, the mysteries, and the quiet moments of reflection. And as night falls over the ring, the stones stand patiently, cradling the past and inviting us to listen, to breathe, to dream, and to remember that some stories are told not in words, but in the soft, enduring language of stone and shadow. The soft whispers of wind weave through the ancient stones, carrying with them tales that stretch beyond centuries. In the quiet stillness of the night, the ring becomes a cradle for memory, where the voices of those long gone gently mingle with the rustling leaves and the distant call of the raven. Each stone, worn by time and weather, holds a fragment of a story, some visible, others hidden deep beneath moss and earth. As one sits in the circle's embrace, a calm settles, a soothing hush that wraps around the senses like a gentle lullaby. The mysteries of the builders become less pressing questions and more like quiet companions on a journey through time. Their silent presence invites us to slow down, to breathe deeply, and to find comfort in the enduring cycles of nature and life. The circle reminds us that, much like the seasons and stars, our own stories are part of a greater whole, a never-ending dance of beginnings and endings, light and shadow, sound and silence. And in this moment, as eyelids grow heavy and thoughts soften, the ancient ring offers peace, a sanctuary not just of stone, but of quiet understanding. Rest now, knowing the past is cradled gently beneath your feet, and that the whispered stories of the mysterious builders will keep watch as you drift softly into sleep. End of script. Good night.